Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the e-conference responding to Fall Armyworm in Asia. And this e-conference is organized by STSN, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. So yesterday we had a great session with Keith Gressman and Chris Wijkhuis, and they talked a bit about the basics of fall armyworm. So what do they look like? How do you recognize them in fields? What are the ways that we can respond to this? How can we monitor this crisis? And how can farmers get assistance in working with fall armyworm? And already in their presentations, we heard quite a strong message that IPM is the way to go, that you shouldn't go for pesticides as a first choice, second choice, or a third choice. And they also mentioned BT maize, biopesticides, biocontrol. And these are some of the topics that we will talk about today. So we have three presenters. We will try to stick to the 90 minutes. We went overtime yesterday. We may go overtime again today. Apologies for that, but I think our presenters have many interesting things to say, so I do want to give them the time for that. You can type in your questions in the chat box on the right like you did yesterday. It was great to see that so many of you were replying to each other's questions, so it would be great if you can keep that up today. And that is also something you can do on our online conference platform, of course. You already see people there that are trying to connect to each other in the same country, or people with the same function in different continents. So it's good to see that, and let's keep doing that. Let's keep connecting. And a final reminder, we get quite a lot of questions about this, and rightly so. Whether the videos will be shared. Yes, the videos will be shared. After this live session, they are on YouTube forever. It's the same link as the link you're using now. So you can watch it again. You can share it with friends or colleagues if you want. Feel free to do so. Please do so. And whether the slides will be shared, hopefully we will be able to do that. You will see them on Mobilize, the online conference platform. And by the end of the week, we'll also send you an email with everything, all the resources that were shared in this e-conference. So without further ado, I would like to start today's session. Our first presenter is Paul Jepson. He has many years of experience working on IPM. He's a co-director of USDA, the Western IPM Center. He has participated in many of these fall armyworm workshops in Africa and in Asia. And he's currently working with USDA and USAID in developing more sustainable management approaches for fall armyworm. So Paul, please take the floor, share your screen, and we would love to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much, Linda. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. I'm going to try and find my presentation. And here we are. And just checking, can you see that?
Yes, we can see it. Go ahead.
Great. So thank you very much, everybody. I'm co-presenting this with a colleague, Katie Murray, who's an anthropologist at Oregon State University. We're working under USAID and USDA Foreign Ag Service sponsorship and some CIMMYT sponsorship, and we've worked in collaboration with CRS in Malawi recently and other organizations. And my participation in a workshop recently in Bangkok was supported by the FAO, and I have been and still am, I believe, the chair of the synthetic pesticide working group for the FAO. So I've got some background in kind of fall armyworm pesticides and pesticide management, and that's something I wanted to touch upon briefly today. But I hope you can all see this. This is a kind of a time portrayal going from left to right on the screen. And I've viewed, and I've always have viewed, pesticides as for certain applications, they play a role in IPM. But also many of the pesticides that are marketed are just not very good at being pesticides, despite everything we're told. They're just not very efficient. They aren't very effective. They're certainly costly, and they impose more costs than benefits that they derive. And so the kind of lens through which I'm viewing the presentation today is the degree to which pesticides can act as a barrier to IPM adoption in against fall armyworm. So going from the left to right, at the moment, we have highly hazardous and high-risk pesticides that rather dominate marketplaces out there, and that's very much the way industry and other groups operate when new invasive pests come along. And so you'll see in that bottom figure there are some health issues. There's certainly impairment of ecological services. Many of the pesticides being actively marketed have extremely low efficacy. They pose a high resistance risk because they're chemicals that have a fingerprint of resistance already in the genotypes that are in Africa and Asia. And there's a lack at present of clearly understood IPM alternatives. And so pesticides are tending to be the first resort for management. So one goal, of course, is to move away from access to and distribution of and the pushing of these compounds by industry, the more hazardous materials, and to move towards more lower risk inputs. And I'll be talking about that later in my presentation. I'm focusing wholly on pesticides, but of course IPM is much broader than that. And what we want to do is enable a situation where ecological services such as predation and parasitism by natural enemies are enhanced and able to play their role, where uses where they take place of synthetic or pesticides of biological origin are only used when they're, if you like, essential and needed, and that they're of low risk to human health and the environment. And also that there isn't a high risk of resistance onset. And in doing this, we can ensure that IPM adoption is increased. So this is a kind of a hopeful figure. And we're going to explore a little bit in the degree to which that hope might be realized and the role that some of you on this call today might play. So I hope that's a clear kind of start. Just one biological reason why pesticides act as a barrier to IPM. I mean, those of you that have experienced fall armyworm in the field may see scenes like this, where you have to kind of pull apart the maize plant to find those larvae inside the growing point deep into the whirl of the maize. And so unless you are a really expert applicator, and many of the people that we're working with are not expert applicators, you end up with a lot of pesticide on the ground, on yourself, on the neighbor's dog, but really not in the whirl where the insect is. And it's really natural enemies of the pest are far more exposed to pesticide than the pest itself. So in addition to the fact that many pesticides are more toxic to natural enemies than they are to the pest insect, this kind of physical reason for a lack of exposure to the pest leads to a reduction in natural enemy populations, we are sure. And I would argue that's a barrier to IPM adoption. And it occurs just as much in Oregon, where I'm speaking from at the moment, at midnight on the west coast of the United States, as it does in Africa and Asia. So there's some pressing challenges: broad spectrum, highly hazardous or high risk pesticides that are often ineffective despite what is claimed are in widespread use against fall armyworm. These have health and environmental impacts, and they act as barriers to IPM adoption. And so the way we view this at the moment in USAID and the Foreign Ag Service and the program that we have with many collaborators is that some change is needed in the regulatory sector, in research and extension, and our ability to communicate directly with farmers who are often resource poor and don't have access to high levels of education, training, and support. We have this hope, it's always there, and this has often been stated. And the first time I went to Africa in the 1980s, very similar statements were made, but we always have the hope that progress can also occur. And with the level of communication we have now, at least we're making the world more aware of the realities on the ground of what happens when pests such as fall armyworm invade, and those that can seek to make a profit from this join in the frenzy. And unfortunately, a result is that resource-poor farmers are exposed to highly toxic pesticides. And that's something most of us, I hope, would wish to avoid. So an agenda for action, which we talked about at the FAO meeting I discussed a few minutes ago, was Asian stakeholders really have to be part of the decision-making consultation. This can't be the closed shop between regulators and the pesticide industry and agencies that has happened in the past. The technical guidance is needed for governments to procure pesticides where these are distributed, guidance on risk reduction, which is not intuitive. It's something that needs to be taught. It's a skill that needs to be developed. And then in resistance management. Technical support is needed, which FAO has taken the global lead in for phasing out highly hazardous pesticides and in risk reduction. And clearly, there are some materials out there that offer the prospect of lower risk and efficacy, and we hope affordability. And through some of this, then, good work, some clear barriers to IPM adoption can be removed or at least suppressed. And so all of this requires a lot of coordination within and among partners, and people going it alone, as it were, without necessarily working with all the partners out there that have good intentions and a will to meet needs in the field and address the pressing needs of resource poor farmers, really can act together to achieve some progress. But note, the smallholder farmer experience is very different to the reality that's often represented by the R&D sector in very optimistic seminars about IPM, and all the good and great ideas that are out there are still good and they're always great. But are they adoptable and affordable by the farmers that are most exposed to fall armyworm and its impacts on maize yield? So we argue that progress requires analysis and understanding of, for example, the pesticide marketplace and the needs and motivations of farmers. And throughout the rest of my presentation now, I want you to be asking yourself, what role can you play in helping move things along in a positive direction, and not simply jumping to one pole or another, pro-pesticide, anti-pesticide, pro-organic, pro-so-called conventional? Really, the solutions lie in many of the dimensions of the IPM that we're hearing about in this conference. So what role can you play in bringing about something positive? We believe very much in getting into the real realities of what are taking place on the ground. And in Malawi, we discovered in February, these are remarkably different to the perceptions we have from reports and presentations that are widely made available. So my colleague Katie and I, USAID partners, Catholic Relief Services, CADICOM, a Catholic aid organization within Malawi, and Save the Children, worked together to consult extension agents and farmers on their current practices. We didn't prompt them, we didn't provide them with education up front, we didn't imply there was one answer that we would prefer over another answer. We just wanted to hear about the realities of what is happening on the ground. This will be published soon through CIMMYT and this needs assessment, and it's a very interesting reading. But I was just going to look at one part of this today because I've just got 8 or 9 minutes left, I believe. And I was going to examine our consultations with agricultural dealers and the pesticide marketplace. Because what is actually sold and what is available to farmers and what is affordable, it's extremely important to determine that. And so we conducted quite a widespread survey with agricultural dealers who were all very open and happy to discuss what pesticides are available in the marketplace in Malawi. And it turns out the dominant compound is a material that's no longer usable in the United States. It was sold by Syngenta in the United States until a few years ago, but it was discovered it was far more persistent and far more toxic and available to farm workers than had previously been disclosed or understood. And so uses in cotton were eliminated, and this compound isn't sold here any longer, but it's a highly toxic organophosphate. And it turns out it's the most widely available and used pesticide against fall armyworm in Malawi. So why is this? It has low cost, it's available, it's there, someone's importing it, it's being synthesized, manufactured, distributed. There are claims for its effectiveness, and it has this fundamental property of very, very long persistence, which may play into its ability to have broken through into this farming marketplace. So I'm going to explore this a little bit more, but this is what I would term an ugly situation. I mean, there's absolutely no excuse for anybody to be selling such a toxic material to farmers who don't have access to protective clothing or basic education on application methods or use of materials of this form. So here is a list of chemicals, and when this talk is made available to you, you can download this table. But you see here a list of materials with good to excellent, G to E, poor, poor, poor to fair efficacy. The list of chemicals are those that are distributed in Malawi, some distributed by the government. Those that are in bold, chlorpyrifos, cypermethrin, and profenofos, the ones that are in the marketplace stores that we went to and are used by farmers. And you'll see going left to right, red indicates high risk, for example, to applicators, to bystanders through inhalation, to aquatic organisms, to wildlife and domesticated animals, and to pollinators. And unfortunately, the chemicals that are most widely available to farmers and sold to them are those that seem to be amongst the materials with the highest level of risk and the highest requirements for a long period of restricted entry before it's safe to go into the field after application. So why is it that materials that have a better record of efficacy and seem to be far less hazardous to farmers, wildlife, pollinators, aquatic systems, why are they less used? Well, we had many consultations, and cost plays into this in a big way. Importers are simply not prepared to import a material that costs more than a farmer is able to pay. So chlorpyrifos, deltamethrin in this case, if you look at this table from the World Bank, and lambda-cyhalothrin, are all relatively inexpensive, $2 to $3 per hectare for an application, whereas some of the more favored materials, such as emamectin benzoate, proclaimed fit, or flubendiamide, or belt, or indoxacarb, steward in this case, they're all $11 to $30 a hectare, and that's way beyond the means of even moderately prosperous Malawian farmers. So we have a situation where the materials that are most widely available are those that are inexpensive, but they also are broad spectrum, in some cases highly toxic to farmers and the environment as well, and their families. And there's also a documented record of resistance to these materials. And this is something none of us, I hope, on the call would wish to be happening, but it's kind of understandable, because if this scary new pest appears and threatens yield and makes the field look pretty trashed when it's active and abundant, farmers throughout the world jump first to options such as inexpensive pesticides that may offer some immediate solution. So some of you have asked in other parts, in some of the questions that were posed initially, which materials may be less toxic. And here, for example, are a group of materials that are of interest to USAID and other partners. They offer efficacy to this genotype of fall armyworm in other parts of the world, and they've been tested in Africa now. And for example, in South Sudan, I believe, and in some parts of East Africa, nuclear polyhedrosis virus, a disease that's specific to Spodoptera frugiperda, the fall armyworm, is proving to be highly efficacious. Azadirachtin on this table is an extract from neem. It can be sold as a formulated product, and the seed extract is far more efficacious than the leaf extract. But some of the homemade cottage industry azadirachtin extracts also seem to be quite good. And you'll see on this table that bystander risk, aquatic life risk, domesticated animal risk, pollinator risk, and applicator risk are all low. So there are some materials out there that offer prospects for less hazardous outcomes and also efficacy, which is something which often seems to fall by the wayside, surprisingly, in the pushing that takes place of certain chemicals into the marketplace. And you'll see below here that pyrethroids in general, profenofos and chlorpyrifos, which are the most commonly used pesticides in Malawi, again, I'm showing you that these confer high risks that many people would consider to be unacceptable given the availability of other materials. So I just wanted to note at the end of my call that in much of the work we've done in Africa, there have been claims that farmers don't really use pesticides, there isn't an active marketplace, they're only treating small areas, they're not really exposed. And if you, all of the papers I'm citing are in the open source literature, and they're in high impact journals, so they have very high standards of peer review. This is research we did in Senegal, where on the vertical axis, you've got the frequency of detection in little silicone wristbands that were put on farmers. And on the bottom axis, we have the concentration of pesticides. And if you look at the 50% point on the vertical axis, the dotted line here is an organophosphate called chlorpyrifos, which has extremely high risks to bystanders and farm workers, including the potential for neurological harm. And there's concerns about impacts on unborn children when pregnant women are working in agricultural fields. The concentrations of this material and others that we found are amongst the highest that have ever been recorded using this system in the world. So it just is not the case that farmers are either not exposed or exposed minimally in African countries, because with a lack of basic education about personal protection, a lack of availability and high cost of protective equipment, and the large number of hours people spend in the field before, during, and after application, exposures can be very high. So one point I want to make to you is, although some of these compounds may be more expensive, we don't factor in the costs of the burden of health impacts of materials that are less expensive. So I'm not offering a solution here, but given the cost of some of the more selective, more efficacious, lower risk materials, isn't it time we tried to find a way to make these more available to the farmers that could benefit from their use, but are resource poor at present? So again, going through a kind of an agenda for action, having people actively participate in decision making and to make this system more transparent and more scientifically based and more evidence based is important. Providing technical materials on areas that are not intuitively obvious, such as how you procure pesticides that strike a lot of different balances of costs and benefits, how farmers themselves can reduce risks with limited access to education, how resistance can be managed, because at the moment many pesticides entering the marketplace are those which there's already a record of resistance, which is not unusual in the United States either, but it's a really unpleasant phenomenon to observe. Technical support is needed for phasing out certain materials, because the people that import pesticides and make them available to farmers are themselves not to blame, in a sense, for what is made available to them, what is affordable, and what is available for distribution. So there needs to be support by government agencies and the commercial sector to make it possible to phase out highly hazardous materials and make low-risk materials that are efficacious and affordable more available if pesticides are part of the resultant IPM that we hope to occur. So pesticides do act as a barrier to IPM adoption because they inhibit natural enemy management of limitation of the pests. They create pest outbreaks such as mites and other insects, and overall the population densities of pests increase where broad spectrum pesticides are used. So we do need to have locally relevant education that's not anti-pesticide, it's just factual about the pesticides, and it's dealing with efficacy as well as impacts. All of this requires a lot of coordination amongst partners, but there's a lot of knowledge out there now, and we always try to publish our work in high impact journals and make them publicly available as open source papers. That's all I had to say today, but if there are any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. And Linda, I'd appreciate guidance on what to do with the screen sharing. But thank you very much for listening, and I hope that was a worthwhile contribution to this excellent conference.
That definitely was a useful contribution. You can stop sharing with the button at the bottom of the page. It says stop sharing. Yeah, now we're back to normal screen. So we already have a number of questions that have come in. I would first like to ask one that came in ahead of the conference from a participant. This person is asking, is there anything you can do when you have applied these pesticides that harm your natural enemies in the field? What can you do to recover those natural enemies again?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things that you can potentially do with providing other resources for natural enemies that they might require. In the West, we sometimes invest in plants that provide nectar and pollen for as protein and energy sources, but that's quite an expensive thing to do. In general, these smallholder farms that we've been to have rich assemblages of natural enemies, and the fields are quite small, and the natural enemies evade these readily. However, profenofos, this revoltingly horrible chemical, I don't know how else to describe it, that's used in Malawi, it's sprayed 4 times on a 2-weekly basis. And they use a brush in a bucket and apply it to the crop by shaking the brush. That's going to suppress natural enemies for weeks on end. And so really avoiding unnecessary uses, applying only to hotspots in the field, and using the most selective, low-risk chemical that you can afford to apply, all of these things are advisable compared with using organophosphates, carbamates, and pyrethroids, which all eliminate natural enemies effectively for substantial periods. And this is one of those hidden things when people talk about efficacy. I believe these compounds have negative efficacy. They cause pest outbreaks. They don't solve them. They just happen to have some impact on the pest because they're so persistent and so toxic that even if there's some resistance, that long period of high toxicity that remains in the field has some suppressive effect. But that does not compensate for the loss of natural enemies. And I think it's very, very important that we publicize this and make the research available that's really out there. And it has been for a very, very long time to make it clear that these materials don't play a role in IPM.
Yeah, and someone was asking, Amani was asking whether there is a list that people can consult on what are the most hazardous pesticides, the ones that you should just never use.
Yes, there is a chapter of the CIMMYT USAID Fall Armyworm IPM manual that's available on the internet. Chapter 3 of that, which I've cited in the end of my talk, has a list of the highly hazardous materials that we were aware of at the time we wrote that chapter. I'm just about to submit some more papers and reports about what we've actually found in Africa. And I'm just about to return to Malawi and then to Kenya to work with, including Ivan, who's asked a question on finding better ways to distribute information on the chemicals that should not be used, because this will contradict some of the information that's out there, but it's a very scientifically based, rational and ethically based approach that we want to see magnifies. But if you go to chapter 3 of the now 2-year-old IPM manual that was published by USAID, you'll find our current list of highly hazardous and risky materials.
Yeah, great. We will make sure to share that again with participants. I think it's on the online platform, but we will highlight it once more. And also looking forward to the publication you cited in your presentation to see, to read it, because it's great, this approach of adaptable and affordable. That's really something that is stuck to my mind in this presentation. It's a basic question, but it's the most relevant one. We can recommend many things. And I think that's also something we saw in your presentation in the e-conference on Fall Armyworm for Africa. This whole calculation and consideration. So I will share that with people as well.
I mean, we learned that, just a final comment, that I learned in Bangkok at the FAO meeting that there's research conducted in Zambia on the efficacy of some of the methods farmers themselves have come up with. And I think there was a finding that for those farmers that have the time and capacity to even to sprinkle soil and other materials into the world, it might sound like a slightly crazy idea, someone's a bit desperate to do that. However, what those researchers found, they got what they interpreted or calculated to be 40% efficacy. Because you could say to yourself, well, that's not terribly good compared to a chemical that might give me like 80% efficacy or 90. However, that level of suppression combined with natural enemies is something that's really not going to confer other harms. And so when you think about costs and benefits and the fact a farmer may get almost zero efficacy if they have no training in how to use a pesticide effectively and to protect themselves when they're applying it, the gain seems to be on the side of some of the methods that farmers are coming up with. And I think they've been very underrated. And so, that I see a very good justification for exploring biopesticides and other materials, but also, discovering those few materials that can be used in hotspots, in limited areas, that are highly efficacious, but not really risky and can be used with minimal protective clothing. So that's really the message I've got today.
Yeah, thanks for highlighting that. I think that's also, it reminds me of something that Chris shared yesterday, that if infestation levels are, I think it was above 25%, there's more damage to your crops than when it's below a certain level. So if you have this 40% efficacy, it can bring you down to a level, excuse me, where
but please remember, if you're
harm.
scouting and are using it, if you're using like a 30% action threshold and your application has almost no efficacy at all, which is the case for some of the pesticides that are being marketed, kind of that argument no longer applies. You must remember that people that are pushing a threshold quite often are arguing that you should use this product or that product, but the assumption is that if you apply it, it's going to actually have an impact on the pest. If it has limited impact on the pest because of resistance or because you don't apply it properly, or it kills natural enemies and you get a sting in the tail, then that argument no longer applies. So the arguments about using thresholds are challenging. But I see George, who's a most extraordinary FAO research and development leader in Malawi, has asked about the need to target applications in the leaf whirl, which seems appropriate. But George, I mean, we all need to also point out that if someone's applying the chemical into the leaf whirl, they have to recalculate the concentration of pesticide in the spray tank, or else you end up with a 5 to 50 times higher application rate than the manufacturer would otherwise recommend. So if you apply at a much lower concentration, then it's okay to apply in the leaf whirl and get that wetting agent and pesticide solution into the whirl. So very good point. But application rates have to be recalculated if you're doing little squirts rather than a continuous gradual spray. Anyway, thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's just one final question before we move on to our next speaker. It's a question that came in from Lillian, and she is asking whether it's possible to ban the hazardous pesticides. Would that be more effective than telling every individual in a country that they shouldn't use it?
Yeah. So my comment there is not meant to sound cynical, Lillian, but good luck with that, because hardly anything is actually banned anywhere. Some pesticides are withdrawn from registration. In some marketplaces, it's not illegal to sell pesticides that are not registered because there's a backlog of chemicals for registration. So despite our best intents, banning and the regulatory process seems to be interminably slow. I mean, I've only been working since 1977 in agricultural fields, but in the 1970s, I was hearing very similar arguments. And, I've been working, 43 years now, and, sadly, we're saying the same thing. So the argument is get this information out there, listen to scientists and farmers themselves and other experts, as well as the regulatory sector and industry, encourage regulation to evolve and improve, and consider banning and withdrawing chemicals from the marketplace, which is incredibly rare. It hardly ever happens. But at the same time, if farmers understand which chemicals may offer them a better prospect, and there are options for use of those that they're not intimidated by because we're pushing a kind of anti-message, and so people throw their hands in horror, let's be practical and positive, then there are options out there which would confer much lower risk than many of the other solutions that are being pushed at the moment.
Very clear. So I think we leave it with that for you for now.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
And for the replies, and we'll be in touch about all those resources that you were talking about. If there's time at the end, we will come to some discussion questions.
Great. I'll be listening in, and thank you very much.
Thank you. So now I would like to move on to Malvika. There she is. She is the regional coordinator for the CABI flagship program Plantwise, and she has over 20 years of working experience on biological control of crop pests and pathogens. And yeah, she's an expert in biological control in many national, international projects. And I would love to hear what she has to say today about biopesticides and biorationals. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Linda. Thank you for having me here. I would just start sharing my screen so that I come to my presentation straight away.
Thank you. Yes, perfect. Go ahead.
Greetings from India, and thank you very much for having me for this e-conference today with a very, very special and important topic, that is fall armyworm. Well, fall armyworm in Asia has come just a year ago, but there has been so many activities around it that this seems to be the most prime for the plant protectionist right now. So I would be speaking on biological control agents and biorationals for management of fall armyworm. And as Linda has already introduced me, I'm the Asia Regional Coordinator for CABI Plantwise. Paul, thank you very much for your talk, and I think you have set up a stage for me to speak and promote more on biocontrol, which certainly seems to be the need for the farmers for today. So going by definition, these biocontrol, it is actually an action of living organisms, which is introduced by us in form of a product or a technology to regulate the population of another organisms. And in this case, it is fall armyworm that we are targeting to bring down the density of those pests, which is much lower if we add biocontrol agent of it. So this is a typical definition which was given by Paul Debach in 1964. And biological control, it primarily consists mainly using of predators, parasitoids, and pathogens. Well, parasitoids, as you can see, they are much larger than the host itself, and they are very intimately associated with a specific host. So specificity in this case is very high. Predator, as compared to parasitoids, are less specific, and they are like what we see ladybird beetles and such predators in the nature. Pathogens, of course, it's mostly microbials, and they parasitize the insect, the host insects, and they cause infection. Just to broadly say that today I would be speaking more on the mechanisms of these biocontrol agents, their advantages, and what are the challenges that we face in Asia to bring them into a commercial aspects. So biocontrol primarily falls into the three categories. And this is like classical biological control, which is generally by introduction. For example, fall armyworm is an invasive, which has come to a new area of introduction. And over here, it lacks its own natural enemies. So it is a need that we study that what is the complex of natural enemies in its native region, and then bring those after examining and studying them to the area of introduction. So this is also called inoculative, and this is generally very successful in the case of invasive species. Then there is biological control by augmentation, like how Paul was just explaining that sometimes the chemicals disbalances the number of natural enemies in the atmosphere. So over here, if we do inundative release of the natural enemies or release them by human interventions, then we can expect that these natural enemies will go and establish a natural environment, and then they'll be able to bring down the population of the pests. So these are very successful, and they are in form of releasing predator, parasitoids, and even pathogens. So the third category is like conservation, how to make these bioagents that we spoke about it by being introduced in classical and augmentation biocontrol, how to make them established in the natural environment. So there are certain methods which would favor the efficiency of natural enemies which are already present in the system, or make like kind of attract them to the area of introduction and keep them happy over there. So these are the three categories through which we introduce biological control, and all the three methods are presently being recommended for fall armyworm in Asia. So, just taking you back to the native region, Latin America, where the natural infestation of fall armyworm exists. So, over here we see all the three categories being present in and bringing the population down. So, some parasitoids can be considered for introduction in Africa and Asia as well. But while we select those, we have to be careful in the criterias that we need to see that they are parasitizing in higher percentages in the area of origin. They are specific, like they do not have any risk to the non-target organisms in the natural environment, and they should support the natural enemy complex of fall armyworm in the introduction area. That is, they do not have any interspecific or intraspecific competitions amongst themselves. So what are the advantages of biocontrol? We know there are many, but just to specify a few, we know that mostly the maize growers in Asia are smallholders, and they have diverse cropping system. So in such kind of cropping system, it is good to have biocontrol agents to maintain an equal equilibrium. And then we also know that the farmer, they do not actually focus too much on the spray in maize cropping system, which is really ideal for conservation of these natural enemies that we introduce. There is no case of resistance. That is another plus point. And of course, biocontrol is it has a low environmental impact and is IPM compatible. But what is needed right now is to evaluate these biocontrol agents in different countries and also come up with country-specific recommendations. So to introduce biological control in any of the countries in Asia at the moment, we would need two kinds of surveys. And one would be native natural enemy survey, which will actually find out the natural enemy in the native region and then bring it to the area of introduction, and also local natural enemies, which would also, because some of these natural enemies would be present in the area where fall armyworm has infested. So it is good to have a local natural enemy survey, collect these kind of natural enemies complex, then also barcode them and do bioassays to understand. CABI is right now working with ICAR NBAR in India to do so, and also with Bangladesh Agriculture Research Institute in Bangladesh to conduct such natural enemy surveys. Well, historically, CABI has also done surveys in 4 countries in Latin America, like Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, and Nicaragua, to assess these parasitoids. And because the environment was almost, and the habitats were almost similar to those found in Asia, we can imagine that these parasitoids can be of importance to countries like countries of Asia for the introduction. So there are still some ongoing studies done in CABI, Switzerland, with some biocontrol agents imported from Bolivia, and also IITA Benin imported from United States. There are also some predators that are found in maize ecosystem, which can be beneficial and in suppressing fall armyworms. So these are some earwigs and some pentatonome bugs that can be seen in the maize ecosystem. For example, earwig is so potential that it is in the maize roll, and it can easily devour up to 10 to 12 larvae of fall armyworm in a day. So then coming to the augmentation of biocontrol, how these can be increased in a maize ecosystem. So this can be done by the regular release of the parasitoids. Most promising agents as studied in Africa and also being studying in Asia, it is seen that egg parasitoid trichogramma and Telonimus remus is very promising in controlling fall armyworm. It has already been used in Africa, and fortunately, Africa and Asia both have these species present in nature. They are very safe to apply on plants, because if we are spraying chemicals, we can understand the whole of the crop gets covered by the spray of the chemical. But here, if we are using these natural enemies as augmentative strategy, then we can think about point release, and it would be good to release them so that they search the pest by themselves. And since they have very short life cycle, it is always recommended that we go for 3 to 4 spaced out consecutive release in the ecosystem. So either we spot the egg mass and then start the release of these parasitoids, or we know that fall armyworm is migratory in nature. So the trap catchers that are indicated in the pheromone lure traps can also guide us in these kind of releases. Trichogramma has already been studied by ICAR and BAIR in India, and they have shown that it can parasitize more than 50% of fall armyworm eggs in nature. So coming to the biorationals now. So biorationals are pesticides, or we can say biopesticides, which have much more shelf life than the natural enemies that I was just talking about. They are safe to the environment, and they are derived from natural sources like botanicals and biopesticides, basically microbials. So looking at the status in India, we see that there are a number of biopesticides which are registered in India, and currently there are a lot of evaluations in progress for fall armyworm. Because to get a product registered for commercial use, we should also have a label claim, and hence this activity is in progress. Similarly, in countries like other Asian countries like Myanmar and Bangladesh, there are several entomopathogen products registered, but evaluation have to be initiated for the pests. Now talking about one of the biopesticide, which is nuclear polyhedrovirus. Paul also touched in his presentation about this. This is very, very specific to fall armyworm. Actually, there are two kinds of baculovirus. For fall armyworm, one is granular virus and the other is the polyhedro viruses. So they are, out of these two, baculovirus is much more preferred because it is highly specific and it has got high host virulence for fall armyworm. It is better that this application takes place when the plant is almost 6 to 8 leaf stage, and the recommended doses for this product can be 2.5 into 10 to the power of 11 polyeclosion bodies per hectare. So when this product is sprayed in the field, the larvae, it comes in contact with these contaminated leaf, ingest the virus, and then these polyhedral eclosion bodies get inside the body of the larvae and release infective virons. So once the larvae gets infected, though it dies after 6 to 8 days of ingestion, but its diet, its normal diet, just goes down by 7% of the normal diet. And the best thing about this is that the virons keep on multiplying in the insect body till it's get full with the virons, and then the insect body bursts to release these virons in the nature. So it is like a self-propagation and reduces the number of sprays that we can think about. So currently in Asia, ICA NBR has an indigenous strain which has been discovered by the institute, but products are also available by Ag Biotech, and the currently being researched for commercialization in countries like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. Well, apart from being good, it also faces certain challenges, like age of the larvae has to be very specific while we spray these biopesticide, and the environmental condition also conducive. Also, quality of the virus should be very, very perfect while we spray, while we take up such sprays. production cost, application timings, all are important, and so is registration for the commercial, which is tedious. But then there are certain steps taken towards the registration of products, especially for fall armyworm, understanding the emergency of having these products on ground. Another biopesticide that I would like to talk about are entomofungal biopesticides. So they are basically more broad in spectrum of action than the nuclear polyhedroviruses. So in case of fall armyworm, it is seen that there are three entomofungal which are really found effective. That is Beauveria bassiana, Metarhizium anisopli, and Metarhizium rilli, earlier known as Pneumonia rilli. So unlike virus, they have to be contact in action. The spore catches hold of the integument of the fall armyworm and starts the destruction of the tissue by producing toxins. Here, the body of the insect gets mummified, hard to touch because it is full of spores. And again, when there is humidity in the nature, the spores come on the surface of the insect body and is again disseminated in the nature. So this is a self-propagation method which helps. So ICAR India again has tested it, and they have found that it leads to 86% of larval reduction in the field. Pneumonia really, though, is very effective in the nature. We could see many cadavers during the monsoon time, but then it is very difficult to produce. So hence, there has to be a focus on research to make this entomofungal available as a commercial product. Now, for another biopesticide, which is much talked about, is Bacillus thuringiensis, a bacterial pesticide. And then we see that it is relatively level, this host specificity is not so much as in viruses, but it is still there. And the factors that is actually brings down the efficacy of Bacillus thuringiensis is because in fall population itself, we see that there are mixed population, and then hence we see a mixed responses to the endotoxin that is produced by Bacillus thuringiensis. Again, the evaluation in India shows that 84% of larval reduction with this particular pesticides. Then the challenges remain the same for this, like registration, cost, and applications. And hence there should be a focus to standardize the protocol for testing, and also which would help a registration of BT against the fall in the Asian countries. Another potent biopesticide is entomopathogenic nematodes, and the most potential species in this is Heterorhabdus bacteriophora, Heterorhabdus indica, and Stenenema carpocapsae. So application time for biopesticide, yes, we need to be a little specific that we prefer morning or evening hours. But nematodes are like vectors. They are tiny nematodes carrying septicemia causing bacteria. So they enter the insect through its spiracles, and once they are inside the insect, they release the bacteria that they are carrying, which produces septicemia. So again, once the insect is full of such kind of bacteria, what happens is, again, it bursts out and it releases nematodes in nature. So there are almost, the effective dosage would be around 23,000 nematode per square feet. So at the moment, application, of course, is a challenge. In India, the product is available as wettable powder, but CABI is also sponsoring a research in Rwanda to use EPN in new encapsulated form. So a better research on the formulation will indeed help us to exploit this technology for control of fall armyworm. So there are botanical pesticides like biopesticides, and out of these, the most used in Asia is neem, that is Azadirachta indica, and it is recommended at 0.25% of neem oil. That can cause larval mortality up to 80%. So there are n number of commercial products which are available from India and are being exported out, and it is a well-practiced strategy in Asia. Now, coming to pheromones, which is the most popular of biorationals, and which is generally seen to be used not only for monitoring but increasing the number of traps. They can be also used for mass trapping and for now for mating disruption as well. So ICOR NBR has come up with a controlled release dispenser, which is making the field life of these pheromones for a much longer. And in India, we have many commercial companies which are producing them as a technicals and also exported out. So some countries where registrations are required for to use pheromone commercially, like Bangladesh, they have gone a step ahead, realizing the emergency issue or because of fall armyworm, and they have facilitated registration to bring these technologies in the country so that farmers can be benefited. Now, this technology can also be integrated with the monitoring system that FAO has brought in, like FAMIERS. And also there are some European countries which are coming up with automated monitoring systems. So pheromones can be very well integrated to such systems as well. Now, bio-based IPM strategy, of course, looks very nice, and we have now understood how we can make environment conducive for biocontrol agent. It is very important we strengthen our monitoring scouting systems to understand when to release the biocontrol agent through inundative releases. So yes, we talk a lot about biocontrol, but of course there is a big constraint on production and the availability of biocontrol agents. But then it is very encouraging to see in Asia that there are many small and medium enterprises that are coming forward to take these technologies. And the best of all, especially for the egg parasitoids and the natural enemies that I spoke in my earlier in my presentation, there are farmer associations who are ready to take them and produce and make them available to the community. The very important aspect of biocontrol is the quality of the product. And I think it is a good idea to associate with public organization to test the quality of biocontrol that we are releasing in nature. CABI also conducted a study to find out what is the status of uptake of biocontrol agents. And it was found that there is a need of big awareness camp because, first of all, farmers don't realize the risk of conventional pesticide, use of conventional pesticide, and they are not really aware of biologicals. And even if they are aware of these biologicals, they treat them as conventional pesticide. They want the result very fast. So there is a need to educate farmer on the use of biopesticides. Not much biological are available in the market, but then there is concerted efforts towards it. And it is also found out by one of our colleagues in CABI when he did a baseline study to find out how the extension officers are recommending biocontrol agents. So there isn't much of the recommendation that is coming from the extension officers at the moment. So there is a need to educate the extension officers and government machineries on this aspect as well. Just to tell in brief about my organization, it is not for profit and intergovernmental. Set up in 1910, we work in agriculture and environment. Right now, there are 49 member countries and we are 400 staff worldwide. So CABI is actually providing proven solutions and tools to farmers for fall armyworm management. And you can find a lot of resources of fall armyworm on our portal, that is www.cabi.org/fall armyworm. And there are various resources which CABI has developed for fall armyworm. And now we are coming up with a biopesticide portal to promote biocontrol technologies amongst the stakeholder. This can be one-stop information shop for identifying the sources of biopesticides. So this is example of the pest management decision guides that we make, and this one is for fall armyworm. Here, just to show that biocontrol is being promoted on an IPM protocol through prevention, scouting, direct control, and also talking about low tox chemicals. So Yeah, this slide is of course very important because this shows how we are reaching out farmers with technologies, and biocontrol is the technology which really needs promotion. So yes, mass media is really good to reach out many, but we see the adoption of technology is very low over here. Whereas farmer field schools, plant health rallies, plant clinics are really one-to-one interface of technology with extension officers, with the farmers, and we see the adoption going very high on such kind of approaches. So CABI has these kind of approaches like Plantwise, our flagship program, wherein plant doctors promote biocontrol agents and technology to a greater extent, and also our program Action on Invasive, which is addressing the growing problem of invasive species through detect, defend, and defeating them. Thank you very much for your attention and your kind listening to my presentation.
Thank you so much, Malvika, for this presentation. From what I see in the questions, it's very dense in the types of information that you shared. Some of the question, maybe it's better we save them for later so you can address them directly because they're really specific. So we'll try to get back to them maybe through email or in another way on our online platform. So one thing I can ask you now, I have so many questions here. um, yeah, so I think I kind of feel this in your presentation, but it seems that the availability, affordability that Paul was talking about is still a huge challenge. Maybe for
Yes.
smallholder farmers, but also for larger farmers. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly the issue that the biocontrol products are not much available to the farmers. But then the government is making a lot of efforts. For example, the institutions, they are tying up with the state departments and through the regional laboratories, sharing their nucleus cultures with them so that they can produce at their end and make it available to the farmers. Also, there are some farmer producer organizations. They understand the merit of biocontrol, and they want the technology transferred to them so that the institutes, the universities are providing the technologies and also backstopping them to produce and supply to the farmers. So I would not say that it is very much prevalent, and we are doing it at full scale, but we certainly have made a start to it.
Yeah, great, great. But still a lot of work. But it's good that all the to see the whole big organizations working together on this because no one can do this on their own, I think. But it is promising. So another question that came in ahead of the e-conference. Where is it now? Oh yeah, whether there is some sort of guide or a large list of some of the things that farmers can do in fields. That's more the augmentation and conservation. And is there a biocontrol guide available?
I would say I found this book by USAID, Summit, Fall Armyworm in Africa, Guide for Integrated Pest Management, very, very useful. And they provide a chapter on biological control and biorational pesticide for fall armyworm, which really gives detail in on the biocontrol agent, their doses to be used, etc. But I think we need to work it out for Asia as well. So currently, we have developed pest management decision guides in various Asian countries the CABI Plantwise program has developed this in India, in Bangladesh, in Myanmar. And here we go step by step, guiding the users how to prevent and how to scout what are the decision-making points for the release of biocontrol agents, etc.
That is very useful. Great.
And
Yep.
Linda, sorry,
Go
just to
ahead.
tell that these resources are also uploaded on our knowledge bank, which is open access, and they can access, like whoever would like to have this information can access it freely.
Great. So that's for all participants here. It's free to use, and you can also promote it to other people in your network.
Absolutely.
Spread the word in that sense. So as I said, all the specific detailed questions, we will get to them later.
Yeah.
Maybe a last question for now from Amani is wouldn't it be more feasible just to import some of the natural enemies that we know work in Latin America? Like, is
So
it,
it is, sorry? Yeah.
yeah, like, is it worth it to look at all the local natural enemies and then go through the whole process?
Absolutely, because if it is present in the nature, in the country itself, I think that is the best way to go about it because they are already adapted. But sometimes what happens, they are adapted, for example, they are adapted to the same genus. And what happens for the fall armyworm, there can be specific ones. Of course, local native surveys support taking up these bioparasitoids and testing them against fall. But the one which are present in the native, like Latin America, may have higher potency. So we can compare these two and see which one is better. But of course, importing biocontrol agents in the country is a long and tedious process. They have to undergo various policy matters at various authorities. Like in India, we have NBA, which generally allows the importing of any biocontrol agent. It has to be quarantined, it has to be studied further. And if we already have a natural enemy in the country itself, it's better to take that, study, and see how effective it is, and then use.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we'll leave it with that, just with an eye on time. I also want to give Isaac some time for his presentation, of course. So thank you, Malvika, for your presentation, and maybe we have time at the end for a more general discussion today.
Okay.
Yeah, so Isaac has joined us. Welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank
We
you
have
very
Isaac
much.
Oyediran here today. He works for Syngenta in the US. He is the insect traits resistant management lead for North America, and he has more than 20 years of experience in working with BT insect traits. Ha. Isaac, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us in the middle of the night over there. Look forward to your
Early morning.
presentation. So go ahead, share the screen and share
Okay.
your
Oh,
experience with us.
sorry. Can you see my screen? No.
Not yet.
Okay.
Yes, we can see your screen now.
Okay. Let me go back to.
And there's the presentation. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from where you're listening. Uh, my name is Isaac Oyediran, and I work for the best ag company in the world, Syngenta. I'm the insect trait resistance management lead for North America, and I'm based out of North Carolina, USA. For today's presentation, I'll be talking about the role of insect resistance management for BT crops. My outline will be Syngenta to give you an overview of what Syngenta does, and then talk about AgriShop Viptera, the best trait that we have right now that provides excellent control of fall armyworm, insecticide resistance, insect resistance management, and then insect resistance management for smallholder farmers in our continents, nations like Africa and Asia, and also draw some conclusions. Syngenta is a global company. We are all over the world. The vision of Syngenta is to help small and large farms meet the challenges of global food security. As you all are aware, the population is increasing, and as a result of that, we will need food, and we'll also have to innovate. So Syngenta is involved in research to bring the best technology that will help solve the challenges of global food security. And because we develop traits, we're also very mindful. We take our traits, the durability of our traits into consideration. We care about our traits, and as a result of that, we also develop a proactive insect resistance management plans for these traits so that the growers can derive the maximum benefit from these traits. Syngenta has developed excellent traits that control insect pests of corn. For today's presentation, I will divide those pests into two: above ground and below ground pests of corn. Agrishop viptera is an excellent trait that controls fall armyworm, southwest corn borer, European corn borer, cornea worm, western bean corn borer, and then also a below ground coleopteran. These traits are part of the IPM. Most of the two speakers who spoke talk about IPM. And I think the use of BT2 is an IPM tool. When we are talking about insect pest management, we need to talk holistically. We need to talk about all the tools that are available. The use of BT is also an IPM tool. It's a host plant resistance, where the plant actually produces its defense mechanism. You don't have to spray, you don't have to scout. The moment you plant your your trait, it produces the toxin, and the toxin kills the insect. One will ask, why is it that we don't have fall armyworm problems in the US? It's because of the adoption of BT. BT technology is all over the US in corn. And as a result of that, we don't see the problem of fall armyworm. And that is the more reason why we think it will be also be fair for developing nations to have access to this technology that provides excellent control of fall armyworm. For BT crops, they are the reason for the adoption, very convenient. When you plant, you don't have to spray. Very effective and then cost efficient. But the real concern is that insects, for what they can adapt to any control tactics, as it is with insecticides, synthetic insecticide. So it is with BT traits. There is high selection pressure in the field. When you plant year in, year out, you are selecting for resistance. And that's the more reason why we at Syngenta, we are very particular about our traits, and we develop proactive insect resistance management plans to make sure that we derive the maximum benefit from our traits. This slide shows you the expression of the gene in the plant. The plant produces the toxin, the BT toxin, throughout the plant growth cycle. So at every stage of the plant, you have the toxin being produced. And as a result of that, the protection of the plant is season long. It protects almost all the insect trait pests that feed on corn season long. You don't have to spray. It has no effect on non-targets. Before any trait is launched, a lot of research is done to be sure that the traits we are launching, they are specific. There is no effect on non-targets. And because insects are able to adapt to any control measure, we expect that resistance will occur. And what is resistance? Resistance, in a nutshell, is just change in the sensitivity of the pest population to the product. That's a reduction in the efficacy of the trait. When you are seeing a reduction in the efficacy of the trait to the insect, then you will say we have resistance. Because resistance will develop, like I said in my earlier slide, we always develop insect resistance management plans to be able to delay or prevent the evolution of resistance. And one of those components of insect resistance management plan is the refuge, high dose refuge strategy, which I will be talking about later. There are many factors that can affect the evolution of resistance, and this can be grouped in four major categories: pest ecology, the product use, and genetics of resistance. With respect to pest ecology, when you're talking of the population density, the host range, the pattern of distribution and generation of the insect per year. I think fall armyworm, depending on where you are, it can have many generations per year. And then the product overall efficacy. Is the product efficacious against the target insect pest? The dose, what is the expression of the protein in the plant? And then there are some traits, there are some products that have more than one BT traits, the pattern of expression. Then in terms of what is the market penetration, how widely is this trait being used? And then refuge size. Refuge is an important component of any IRM plan. You have to have a portion of your field planted to a non-BT so that when there is emergence from the BT, it can mate with insects coming from the non-BT. I'll show slides of what I meant by refuge, and also the genetics of the resistance. You want to know what is the initial allele frequency. As we know, in any population, you have some individuals that can carry rare resistance to your technology. And then you want to find out what's the fitness course and then the dominance. For us as Syngenta, before we register any traits, we have two broad categories. Pre-registration measures. We test our traits to be sure that they are efficacious against the target organism. We determine the dose of that trait, and we also determine the mode of action of that trait. How does this trait kills the insect? And also try to understand what the genetics of the resistance, in case there is any resistance in the field. And also, because we have different traits on the market, we try to study whether there's any cross resistance among these traits, and we gather all this information and then run a simulation model to predict what will be the duration of our trait. I mean, we want to know before launching our trait what will be the duration. How many years will this trait be on the market before it's being replaced? And as the trait is launched, we have the post-registration measures. We monitor for resistance. And what do I mean by this? Every year we do insect collection. When we collect the insect, we do lab assays to test whether there's a shift in the susceptibility of this insect to the traits. In case of any resistant issues, there are remedial action plans, best management practices. We ask the farmers to rotate to spray when it's possible. And also we make sure that a compliance assurance plan. This is a big problem. Farmers, because they derive the maximum benefit from our traits, it's always very difficult to really ascertain whether they are in compliance when it comes to planting of the refuge. So we always try as much as possible to talk and tell the growers to do the right thing by planting the refuge. If they plant the refuge, then the durability of the trait can be prolonged. That leads me to grower education. We always do a lot of grower education to let them know that it is very important for them to plant the refuge. The refuge-based resistant management is the most popular because it's a component of the high-dose refuge strategy. You have a trait that is expressing high dose, and then you must have a refuge, a small portion of your field that is planted to a non-BT crop, so that you have emergence of susceptibles coming from those plots that will mate with any insect that come from the BT plant. This is just a schematic diagram of what I'm talking about here. As you can see, Agrishop Viptera is a BT trait field, and then the non-BT refuge field. So what we're trying to do here is that the insects will emerge from the non-BT, and then if there are insects that emerge from the BT, there is a cross mating. There's a random mating of those insects, and then the progeny, the F1s of those progenies, the resistance, the RR stands for the resistant insect, and then the SS for the susceptible. The RRs will emerge from the BT trait, and then the susceptibles will come from the non-BT. And the idea is that there will be a mix random mating of the resistance and the susceptible. And because we have a high dose trait, the heterozygote that carries the resistant allele is recessive, and as a result of that, is not able to transmit the resistant allele to the next generation. So refugees are very important when we are talking of about BT traits. There are different types of refugees. We have the block refuge, seed blend, non-BT, and then natural refuge. When the BT traits were first launched, it was a block refuge that was mandated. In the US, IRM is regulated, is required by all the technology providers to develop an IRM plan for all the technologies they have. So when the first generation of the BT traits were launched, the required uh, refuge was a block refuge, where you plant a block refuge very close to your BT plot. The problem with that was that most growers were not planting the refuge because they were benefiting from the BT crop. So that created a perfect environment for resistance to occur. So because of that, technology providers now came up with a seed blend where you have a mix of the BT and the non-BT together. And then when you plant it, you have both the non-BT and the BT. And as a result of that, we're having very high 100% compliance. Then you can rely on a non-BT crop refuge. Most of the time, it's always difficult because you are not sure if you'll be able to get enough non-BT crops to serve as a refuge. And then we also rely on the natural refuge. You have to survey your environment to see whether you have more natural refuge. If you think you have a lot of natural refuge, then you don't have to plant any uh, non-BT as a refuge. So because we are talking about Asia, and then last year I also talked about Africa, these are smallholder agricultural systems. These are farmers whose farms are very small. They practice mixed culture. And as a result of that, when we develop IRM plants, we have to take into consideration those factors. We can use the same IRM plan that is uh, obtainable in big farms, in farms like in the US, for those farms in Asia and Africa. We have to take those farm sizes, mixed cropping, all the factors into consideration. So some of the guidelines for the smallholder agricultural system is to determine whether you have sufficient refuge. If you have sufficient natural refuge, there will not be need for any additional refuge. And then if the pest migrates all the time, there will not be any need for any uh, refuge at all. Seed providers will have to provide a seed that will be similar to the BT traits. And when you have many BT traits in an area, then there can be a kind of synchrony. The technology providers can harmonize the kind of refuge strategies that they want to develop. Then you can also have a community refuge where the communities will come together and plant one refuge that will serve the whole community. And as a result of that community refuge, you don't have to plant a separate refuge in your field. Most growers don't like to see damage. When you plant a non-BT, that is the refuge, you will always see damage. And the experience has been that most farmers don't want to see damage. So when that occurs, you can treat your refuge. But when you treat your refuge, you have to treat your refuge with a different mode of action. You don't have to use the same trait that you have. You don't have to use, for example, BT formulation to treat your refuge. Technology providers will have to develop pest crop specific best management practices, target the population that's in that environment. We recommend cultural practices where it is necessary to reduce pest populations. And then we also encourage routine monitoring to determine the extent of damage in the field. Education is really very important. We need to educate the growers. The growers need to be educated for them to understand the importance of refuges. We need to include the refuge manuals with the traits. Best management practices should also be included. And then we need to work with organizations like Crop Life, other seed companies to make sure that we are delivering a common message because we all we all have the same trait. And as a result of that, it would be good for us to have a common message to also work together to bring the message to the grassroots. We need to work with government agencies. In the US, for example, like I said, IRM is regulated. It's part of the package that goes to EPA. EPA is the agency that regulates BT. And then before your trait is launched, you have to show that you have a sound science-based insect resistance management plan. We need to talk to the public sector scientists about the need for uh, educating the growers for them to understand the importance of IRM plans. We need to look for local leaders because it's always very effective if you can identify local leaders in an environment who can help deliver your message. We need to train seed dealers and also use the new technologies, media, mobile phones, so that the growers can contact the dealers whenever there is any problem. Monitoring is very important. We need to monitor, like I told you initially, we need to develop a monitoring, simple monitoring programs for the small farmers so that when there is any problem, they can report that to the seed technology providers. And then also the resistance monitoring should be practical. They have to go to the field, scout, and see whether there's any unexpected damage. If they see any unexpected damage, that has to be reported to the technology providers. The program has to be linked to any damage. For example, farmers have to connect with the technology providers anytime there's any problem in the field. We, the companies, work under a group, an umbrella called Agricultural Biotechnology Stewardship Technical Committee, ABSTC. All the companies that develop BT traits, we all work together. And the idea is that we work together to determine what would be the best way to develop the best proactive IRM plans for the traits that we have. Since we are all talking about fall armyworm, I just want to show you this graph. This slide. This is what we are seeing. I mean, Africa has been taken over by fall armyworm, and then it's growing to Asia, and then some parts of Asia. I think we need to allow the growers to assess technologies. If we are talking about IPM, it has to be a holistic approach. There's no one side wins all. We have to allow the growers to assess all the technologies available. And BT trade has proven to be the best control tactics. You don't have to spray, you don't have to scout. And in the US, we don't see the problem of our fall armyworm. And that's why, at least when we talk about IPM, let's talk about IPM in a holistic fashion. Let's use all the tools that are in the toolbox. And the BT is specific. It has no effect on the environment, on the non-target. This is our trait, Agrishov viptera. As you can see, is very, very effective against fall armyworm. You see the non-BT has a lot of damage, but the Agrishov viptera is clean. So that is why, at least allowing the growers to see these benefits, I think will be very, very beneficial. For a practical solution of what is going on right now, I think It will be good for various governments, various communities, various institutions to allow growers to access this technology, BT technology. It has proven, it's been tested, and it has proven to be very, very efficacious against the fall armyworm. So, in conclusion, Syngenta, at Syngenta, we are committed to developing proactive IRM programs. We care about our trees, and as a result of that, we want to make sure that the farmers actually derive the maximum benefit, and that's why we develop proactive insect resistance management plans for our trees. Insect resistance management is very important to delay. It may not prevent, it may prevent, or it may prevent, but it will always delay the evolution of resistance. Refuges are very important in insect resistance management plan. In areas where you've heard about resistance evolution, is because most of the growers were not in compliance. They were not planting the refuge. Um, Again, refuge compliance is very important. And then when we're talking about insect resistance management programs, we have to take into consideration that smallholder farmers, their ecosystem, the farming practice is different from big growers like the ones we have in developed nations. So, in developing those insect resistance management plans, we have to take into consideration their farming practice, and we have to involve leaders, organizations like CropLife, and other organizations, NGOs within those environments. With that, I think that's all I have. We want to bring plant potential to life, and that's what Syngenta is all about. I thank you all for your audience, and if there are questions, I would like to uh, answer those questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac, for highlighting the potential of BT maize and the importance of the insect resistance management. Um, so yeah, it's a big challenge. First of all, to make these BT maize available in many countries, and then also to make sure that people are using the right management approaches. So first question I had is whether there are regulatory barriers at the moment. Is it available in all countries, or are you still working on getting it approved in many countries?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think regulatory challenges are all over there. There are some countries where it's just a big challenge, because in Africa, for example, we don't have the personnel. It's now that people are coming up, training uh, uh, folks in Africa to be able to, I mean, understand what the regulatory framework would be. So the challenges is not the availability, but regulation. How can this uh, trade be regulated? How do we have very good, effective regulatory mechanism? Because without an effective regulatory mechanism, there is the danger, therefore, the trade to be used anyhow. Now, I think companies, technology providers like Syngenta and other companies are working with countries to help them have develop a regulatory framework. And when that regulatory framework is developed, I think the technology providers are ready to provide the seats. But first of all, the regulatory frameworks have to be there. And also, uh, we can work with the regulatory agencies directly to, you know, determine what would be the best way to regulate some of these trades. We have, at Syngenta, we've been working with many regulatory agencies. Our regulatory department work with many countries to uh, to see how easy how they can make things very easy for these trades to be launched in those countries. If the frameworks are there, I think Syngenta is ready to provide the seats.
Okay, thank you. A question that came in ahead of the e-conference from one of the participants is whether there are native traits that you can use in Asia. Do you know about that?
Thank you very much. I don't have any. I don't think there's any native trait that can be used, because right now, if you're talking of native trait, then it means that you screening. I don't think there's any native trait that can be used in Asia. Yeah, so everything that has been is either BT, and there's no. I don't know of any native trait that can be used.
Okay, yeah. And maybe a final question before we go into a bit of a general discussion with the other speakers is from Bozibori. Whether you can perhaps share what BT genes AgriSure comprises?
AgriSure Viptera comprises of Viptera. There are two major classes of BT genes that we use. These are the crystalline proteins. So when you see CRY, anything that is CRY1AB, for example, is a crystalline protein. So when they kill, in its mode of action, it forms crystallines, and then these crystals bind with the meat god. Viptera, on the other hand, is a vegetative insecticidal protein. It forms vegetative insecticidal bodies that bind to the meat god. So AgriSure Viptera contains both the Viptera, that is a vegetative insecticidal protein, and then the CRY protein. So those are the two that are there. But the Viptera alone is really very, very efficacious against um, Fall Armyworm, because we don't want to have just one single mode of action. That's why we always bring in two modes of action. We stack two events together. It's another way of insect resistance management plan, because when you have one mode of action, just one gene, there is that uh, uh, you know tendency, probability that insects will develop resistance. But then when you have two modes of action, then you have reduced the likelihood of resistance developing to that trait. So yes, let's say it has two genes, CRY and then Viptera. So those are the two genes that are in the AgriSure Viptera.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I would like to ask Malvika and Paul to join us again. You already went over time a bit, so maybe just one big question to end it all to all of you. And it's a basic question, but difficult to answer, I think, is what would be your main take-home message or action point for the people that joined today? Yeah, sorry for just dropping that bomb.
Yeah. So, can I say something,
Yeah,
Linda?
please go ahead.
What I feel, especially talking about the technology that I had given a presentation on, this needs a lot of awareness. And I think people who are listening, it would be really great if we can join hands to create awareness about biocontrol products, because they are very, very specialized in nature and they really require a lot of education. So, like how I said in my presentation as well, big awareness campaign, working with farmers more closely and making them realize the potential of biocontrol technology would be really, really good. And I would really love if the listeners could take this as a message to be taken from this conference.
Okay, great. Thank you. I
I
think
think
that's
from the
also a nice
pesticide
run-up
perspective,
for tomorrow. We will have a presentation by Anne-Sophie Poisot, who will talk about communication and reaching out to farmers. Yes, Paul, go ahead, please. Sorry for interrupting.
I think from the pesticide perspective, it's just efficacy. When people talk about X% control or Y% control, the goal of a farmer really is to prevent what to them is unacceptable damage. And so that gold standard, which we tend to kind of adhere to, of kind of absolute eradication, which is hardly ever achievable anyway, is not really the way to think about this. So in the presentation I made, I was really considering efficacy as basically there are all sorts of modes of suppressing this pest, and pesticides, if available, and as I say, low risk and efficacious and affordable, do not have to have to give that like 90% control, as it were, in order to be effective. And many of the compounds we're talking about lead to unacceptable consequences that are incredibly hard to measure. There's almost no medical monitoring of pesticide impacts in Africa at all, anywhere. There's no consideration of chronic impacts such as cancer and other neurological harms that occur. And so taking these risks really seriously and weighing costs and benefits as we're meant to do, I think just thinking again about efficacy in fall armyworm management would be extremely important, and just have a thoughtful approach to that so that we're not stuck in that same treadmill of pushing very broad spectrum pesticides that actually cause more harm than good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And final word for you, Isaac. What will be your main take-home message or action point for people that are listening in today?
I think my own message will be that since we are talking about IPM, we should allow growers to assess any technology that is available. We shouldn't just be promoting one technology. And BT traits have been found to be very effective. They have no adverse effect on human beings, non-targets. And I think it will also be good for various governments to work with technology providers to see how these traits can be launched in their respective environments, because it's a problem. No one solution fits all, and that's why we have to work together, and we need to use all the tools in the IPM toolbox. And the BT technology is an effective tool in the IPM toolbox that can be used holistically with other IPM incident management, integrated pest management tactics to bring a lasting solution to this fall armyworm problem. And I think the companies are also already working with CropLife and other organizations to see how some of these technologies can be launched in their areas.
Great, thank you. So I think that also summarizes our session today, where we learned different aspects of the IPM toolbox and things that farmers can do. And that will bring us tomorrow to the session where we talk about how can you educate farmers about this toolbox and how do they experience fall armyworm outbreaks themselves and how do they deal with that. So we will learn more about that tomorrow. But for today, I would like to thank all three of you for your excellent presentations and for the time that you took for this, especially for those joining us in the middle of the night. I would say sleep well. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Linda. Bye.